Okay, welcome to the penultimate edition of Global Civics. Thank you all for coming. And we're going to do the usual thing. It'll be a sort of a short PowerPoint presentation. Take a short break, then our discussants will come up to the table and talk about what they've seen and heard and what they think about it. Criticism is welcome. Your own thoughts and reflections are always welcome. At a certain juncture later on in the evening, we'll solicit public comment. We have a small crowd here tonight, but who knows? They might be feisty. For the benefit of one or two people who haven't been here in the past, we've sort of taken this a long curriculum unit designed to be taught in a semester and distilled it into a 6-part mini-series. So everything we're doing is in draft, everything is distilled and concentrated and compressed, and hopefully if this works as a pilot, we'll be able to sort of roll out the full-scale curriculum unit across the state and beyond there. Some of you are real familiar with the trajectory we've taken to date. That is, we start from our own position as Montana citizens. We're looking at the world at large through our own experiences, our own lenses. We're looking at the way the world works with a focus on sovereignty, legitimacy, and subsidiarity as sort of cornerstone principles for how the world is organized. And all of that is in the context of globalization, a phenomenon that is happening as we speak. We're going to kind of jump ahead to what I'm proposing is a trajectory of world history. That is, ineluctably, with lots of fits and starts, we're moving toward a global human rights regime. And I don't mean by that a world government, but a community of nations, of states, of organizations, of entities that we don't have a name for yet, all of which are competing to achieve the full realization of human rights on this planet. So to me, that's healthy competition. Who can deliver the goods and services and values the best? So that's an arguable proposition, but that's the one we're working with. And that we're going to talk about human rights this evening. And then in the last edition, we're going to kind of backtrack and talk about what kinds of social organization, what kind of governance instruments and entities and institutions are available to help achieve that end. So with that, I'm going to do a very quick look back. To where we were last week. I kind of took a stab at imposing upon the concept of what we're talking about, global civics, this whole notion of bigness being at the root of so many problems. So I'm bringing that back. I don't want to let go of it, even though it didn't sell very well in our conversation. I mean, there's lots of reasons why it's not so simple to approach the world's problems as simply one of scale. But there's a kind of a lengthy quote there from this author of the book, The Breakdown of Nations. And he kind of cuts to the chase where, you know, no matter how good the people are who are in government, no matter how well-intended they are, if a system's too large, it's going to fail. And I sort of have taken that on as a given, that there are countries in the world that are too big. You'll notice a figure of 200 million. He's referring to the United States, so that's 100 million people ago when he made this statement. But let's consider, you know, the other side of the coin. There are countries in the world that are really, really small but have a huge impact across the planet. I picked Vatican City because we've already discussed that as the smallest country on the planet. You know, you can walk across it probably. I've never been there, but it's probably a 15-minute walk from border to border. And yet, it commands a certain kind of authority over nearly 1 billion people. And that authority is regarded as legitimate by the people who accept the faith. So here's a tiny state, and as Stalin once said, you know, how many divisions does the Pope have? 0 in the 20th and 21st century, but a huge sway. So that's kind of a virtue and a challenge of smallness. That's the good side of smallness. On the other hand, there are many countries, of the 196 countries extant today, some of them are sovereign in legal terms. They are regarded as sovereign states at the United Nations General Assembly. They have a vote, just like everybody else, but they are almost absurdly small. For example, the state of Nauru in the Pacific, 8.5 square miles, 13,000 people. They have a fading or depleting source of revenue from phosphate, just raw phosphate. That's the only economic resource they have, and it's running out fast. They've tried to attract offshore banking to Nauru, but it's one of many countries that are just too small to be sustainable as countries in light of, the great powers of the earth. So I wanted to try to just sort of remind us about this bigness question and bring sovereignty, subsidiarity, and legitimacy into focus. And the last word I'll say about this is that when you have a country that gets too big to function properly, to meet the needs of the people, then one way to deal with that is apply the principle of subsidiarity, to federalize, to subdivide the state into smaller units that are manageable. So with that, we'll move on. What are human rights? The concept of individual rights is rooted in antiquity. The inhabitants of Greek city-states enjoyed, as a consequence of their citizenship, rights to property, freedom of speech, and equality before the law. Slaves were not citizens and therefore had no such rights. Later, philosophers recognized the need for firmer footing because societies tend to break down at irregular intervals and leave citizens at the mercy of merciless thugs, tyrants, and dictators. The Stoics asserted that certain rights should be considered universal, something to which people are entitled simply by virtue of being human, no matter their circumstance in space or time. 18th century thinkers borrowed from these earlier times in elaborating a natural rights doctrine. They held that government does not grant rights, it is established to protect rights possessed by individuals by virtue of nature and nature's God. Perhaps the best known articulation of the natural rights thesis is the Declaration of Independence. And you probably know what follows from that pregnant phrase, we hold these rights to be self-evident. I won't read that then. This was and continues to be a radical proposition. It provides a strong but immaterial foundation for the continuing belief in universal human rights. The concept of natural rights coexists with its opposite, the positive rights doctrine. The latter holds that the only rights humans have are those granted and enforced by government. Positivists argue that it is meaningless to talk about human rights outside a court of law. Jeremy Bentham, one of the foremost exponents of legal positivism, wrote, "Natural rights is simple nonsense. Natural and imprescriptible rights, an American phrase, is rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts." Logical or legal positivism lost most of its logical appeal after the Second World War because Hitler's Third Reich had effectively legalized genocide. The awful yet lawful atrocities of that and subsequent totalitarian regimes elsewhere in the world breathed new life into the natural rights theory. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Rights, I'll be getting to momentarily. I want to mention here two significant developments subsequent to the end of the Second World War. The Nuremberg tribunals established the principle, and legally actionable principle, that individuals can be held culpable for crimes against humanity. So a number of Nazis were tried and convicted, and some were even executed as a consequence of this tribunal. That established a very important principle. I wanted to bring to your attention this individual named Raphael Lemkin, who sort of single-handedly made it his mission in life to establish genocide as a concept and, again, a legally actionable principle. He died a young, relatively young person after having put everything he had into convincing governments, lawyers, ordinary citizens that genocide was a reality. The Nazis proved it, and it needed to be established as a crime. So we have him to thank for what we know today, what genocide is all about. And the other thing I wanted to do is to kind of establish early on that the history of human rights, the evolution of human rights in law, is really the product of extraordinarily courageous and gifted individuals, not mass movements. It really takes individuals to make this thing move through time. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted and endorsed by the United Nations for the purpose of transforming natural rights into positive rights by making them enforceable. Because the declaration itself was not binding, it was sort of comparable to a legislative joint resolution. And the next step for human rights advocates was to come up with something more forceful. The result was a pair of closely related treaties known separately as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and known jointly with the Declaration as the International Bill of Rights. The UN Charter, which preceded these developments, was sort of a constitution for the world without a Bill of Rights. And people understood that without that, not much progress would be made on that front. Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental to the crafting of the Universal Declaration. Franklin Roosevelt, I'll read to you about Franklin Roosevelt. He went on to recommend, after the passage of the Universal Declaration, an economic Bill of Rights for the United States. It was never passed, but its basic construct reappeared in the International Covenants, which entered into force in 1966. Jimmy Carter was the first president to actually, I'm going to back up. Those covenants didn't enter into force in 1966. It took 10 years for a sufficient number of countries to ratify them to become binding law internationally. Interestingly, and I'll get to this later, the United States only in 1992 ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Proponents agreed that two separate covenants were required because civil and political rights, such as rights to vote and to freedom of expression, that's a civil and political right, could be secured immediately, while economic, social, and cultural rights could only be secured progressively according to each country's material and organizational wherewithal. Franklin Roosevelt was the one who took the principles of the covenant, the International Bill of Rights, and set them forth in sort of domestic policy with his four freedom speech. So I should back up. These international covenants, at least the one on civil and political rights, reads very much like the United States Bill of Rights. I won't get into the details right here that spell out what it is, but the right to expression, the right to vote, all those things are included in the Covenant on Political Rights. I want to talk about the United Nations system. And, the United Nations has a lot to do with moving human rights forward. It starts with the Charter, and I will refer you to Article 55. That's where you'll find the most substantive reference to the obligation to honor human rights in the UN Charter. The United Nations created a number of entities to carry out this mission to further human rights worldwide. The Human Rights Council is made up of 46 countries, and they're elected by the General Assembly, and they're regionally representative. In other words, there's a number of countries from Africa, a number of countries from Asia, from each continent. Each continent has a group that gets elected. It's been a controversial organization within the United States forever. It's a successor to an earlier organization because many of the countries that are members of this council are dictatorships. They don't exercise human rights by our standards. You know, just very recently, Turkey wanted to become a member. They were voted down in favor of Venezuela. And a lot of observers of the world situation would say Turkey, the situation for human rights in Turkey is far beyond what it is in Venezuela. Of course, other people would argue differently, and the majority argued differently. But anyway, the United States has refused to participate and engage with the Human Rights Council because of what we regard, our government regards, as too much hypocrisy. The Office of the High Commissioner has sort of an overarching mission to promote human rights around the world. They conduct many, many investigations in all kinds of countries to assess the human rights condition, always in reference to or in relation to the covenants, these binding treaties. Most countries in the world have signed on to these treaties, so they have a legal obligation to meet them. Virtually, well, almost no countries meet all the tests of the covenants they've signed on to. The Human Rights Committee was established to actually monitor and fulfill the the covenant on political and civil rights. Other specialized agencies like UNESCO and the International Labor Organization are also quite involved in the promotion of human rights. I want to say a few things, though, about the United Nations. You know, there's a lot of criticism of the UN. Here in Montana, it's ripe, but much of it is deserved. We can all kind of do a lot of easy research and find out that the UN is populated in New York and elsewhere, in Geneva, all the places where they have offices. People are incredibly intelligent, gifted, well-positioned elites that represent their respective governments. The people who work for the UN, generally speaking, live very well. They talk a lot, they write reports, they issue proclamations, they make speeches all over the world, but the United Nations system is not very efficient, it's very expensive, and it doesn't have sufficient clout to actually make a huge difference in many places. It does make a huge difference in some places, but not everywhere. So the results are monumental amounts of paper resulting from all these meetings among intelligent people. And, you know, I should add, at least in my perspective, there is a stunning amount of hypocrisy at the United Nations. When you hear virtually every country that you could think of that represses human rights speaking as if they don't, it gets old fast. But I think there's an old adage about hypocrisy being the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And that's something that applies also to the United Nations, the Universal Declaration. It's, to this day, the most respected document, even though it has no legal force. But it's become sort of a customary international law in and of itself. No one can enforce the Universal Declaration, but it's the best comprehensive statement available. And people are paying lip service. At the very least, they pay lip service to it all the time. So it's a good guide for future action. Now, the human rights are just one of three major pillars of the UN system. First is peace and security. Second is economic development. And the third is human rights. But increasingly, every effort that the UN makes in all three of these arenas has a human rights dimension. So I wanted to bring into the picture, just briefly, a set of goals that the UN, and when I say the UN, that's all the member countries. It's not a bureaucracy unto itself that governs itself and decides these things for itself. These things are voted on. Well, the Millennium Development Goals were established in the year 2000. And, they're very ambitious goals. eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, just for one. Well, what's really amazing is in the space of the almost 15 years, we're going on the 15, they're about to run out. 2015 is the end game for the Millennium Development Goals. And some of them have been remarkably successful. I mean, back in 2000, I think about 40% of the world's population was regarded as starving. And that's been cut in half. And similar progress has been made on almost every one of these. So it's an amazing amount of success on the part of what's not normally thought of as a horribly inefficient, ineffective organization. And it's all governments working together. So there's an open call now. Okay, what should we be doing beyond 2015? And you can actually get engaged in that process. Another important institution is actually not part of the United Nations, strictly speaking. It's often regarded as a UN court, but it's not. It's separate. It's the International Criminal Court. It's sort of the global outgrowth of the Nuremberg tribunals. And it's also the outgrowth of regional courts set up to deal with genocide. I was going to say conflicts, but genocide, prosecutions in Rwanda, in the Balkans, that started out on a regional basis. There's a Treaty of Rome that created this court. And this is where individuals can be indicted for human rights crimes. And, for example, the president of Sudan is officially indicted for war crimes and human rights abuses in Darfur, Sudan. Now, he hasn't been apprehended, but the court is acting as if it's a possibility that even a head of state can be brought before this International Criminal Court. Now, you'll find it interesting to see who's a member and who's not a member. Canada is a member. The United States has signed this treaty, this agreement, but has not ratified it. We are not officially engaged with the International Criminal Court, nor is Russia, nor is China. China doesn't even recognize the legitimacy of the court. So there's a long way to go in terms of making an international legal system apply to serious abuses of human rights with respect to individuals. In the absence of any kind of rigorous enforcement, there's no global cop to enforce human rights. It's a matter of cooperation among powers, great and small, to bring about anything effective. So that brings in the significance of non-governmental organizations. They're sort of like a nonviolent militia worldwide advocating for human rights. These are just three among many, but these are biggies. The name of the game for NGOs, they don't have armies, they don't have much money. Well, some have a lot of money, but not compared to governments. They want to name and shame governments who are violating the terms of the treaties to which they are signatory and ratified. So it's all about demonstrating with facts and figures and reports and monitoring who is abusing human rights in which ways. And they all pledge dutifully to be accurate, fact-based. They don't receive money from any government. They're always raising money. You probably have responded to solicitations from some of these organizations. They're also in a lot of trouble worldwide, increasingly. This is, to me, a disturbing trend. Countries like China, Russia, Iran, others, are starting to figure out legal ways to bounce NGOs out of the picture. They're not going in and arresting them or abducting them or killing them. They're using laws to obstruct and delegitimize the work of non-governmental organizations, because these governments of great powers do not like meddling by private organizations who are dedicated to revealing the weaknesses and the inadequacies of the same government. Bringing me to, the theme of human rights in the United States. There's a lot of talk about American exceptionalism, and it's easy to come up with reasons to regard the United States as an exceptional and indispensable country. The problem is, more often than not, now it's Americans proclaiming our exceptionalism rather than outsiders doing the same for us. So it's beginning to sound more and more boastful and less credible when we're proclaiming we're the best. And this gets pretty serious because the world perceives the United States as being above, regarding itself as beyond and above the laws that it actually crafted. Most international laws on the books were crafted by Americans in league with others. And yet, officially, we're not behaving as if we're accountable to those very same laws. The UN covenants, we're not obeying those covenants. This shining city on the hill, it is what it is, and it's more and more tainted as we go. I don't want to dwell on that subject at the moment. Human rights in the United States practice doesn't have a high priority in terms of our foreign policy. I'll go through this quickly. These are four major categories of national interest: our survival interest, our vital interest, our major interest, and peripheral interest. And it's in the promotion of values, that is democracy and human rights. It's been treated, notwithstanding President Carter, as a peripheral interest, not worthy of a sufficiency of resources and to be taken seriously. The flags and the pictures are connoting our great arena of common interest with the Euro-Atlantic countries. In other words, the United States, the European Union, and NATO are pretty much together on where human rights belong and how we're going to defend our interests. The pivot to the Pacific, which is happening as we speak, the administration is putting more and more attention and resources toward the Asian Pacific arena. That is requiring a different approach to human rights. On the one hand, we have to deal with China. They hold so much of our debt. We have to do business with China. We have to get along with China. And yet we know there are massive abuses of common abuses of human rights there. We have to look out for the interests of those countries like Japan, Korea, and Indonesia and the Philippines. They are at risk from Chinese expansion. So we're finding we're having to deal with a lot of countries that don't have the same degree of respect for human rights as we know them as our friends and neighbors in the West, in Europe. On the right-hand side, I just want to kind of contemplate how important are human rights to us. I mean, as individuals, I'd say it goes from 0 to high, depending on who you are and what you know. If you're a national government, mid-range at best. Generally a peripheral interest on the part of most governments. Because actually human rights organizations are pitted against their government. It's a battle that's always going on. For NGOs, it's very high in most cases. For the United Nations, well, it's one of the 3 top priority areas of work. For scholars and intellectuals, there's an increasing amount of skepticism among the academic community. I'll use that term unadvisedly. A lot of skepticism about the actual merits of human rights as we know them, that this trajectory of history may in fact be a fabrication of our aspirations and not reality. For the people in Montana, well, we're going to see about that just shortly. And on the left, there's actually a physical aside. that fellow in the lower corner is Tim Coulter. He resides in Helena. Some of you will know him. He runs the Indian Law Resource Center, and he, as an individual, with help, was one of the drafters of the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has been adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's not binding, it's not a treaty, and yet it's an assertion, a formal assertion, that indigenous peoples are deserving of all the human rights that other people have as well. So we have in our midst here in Montana outreach to the globe. I know I'm running out of time, and I'll get there shortly. So human rights in Montana, I don't think it's a common conversation, talking about global rights and human rights in Montana and considering them all of a piece. So the nexus for international human rights, those covenants, and our own human rights statutes and the Constitution is the problem of discrimination. So our Constitution has a very special provision, one of several, as you know. There is in Article 2, the Declaration of Rights, Section 4, a right to individual dignity. The dignity of the human individual is inviolable. No person shall be deemed this. Sorry, I've spilled coffee on this section. Kelly, would you come out and read this for me? You'll be able to see it better. Here you go.
Which one here?
This one right here. You'll see it better than I can.
Okay. Individual dignity. The dignity of the human being is inviolable. No person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws. Neither the state nor any person, firm, corporation, or institution shall discriminate against any person in the exercise of his civil or political rights on account of race, color, sex, culture, social origin, or condition, or political or religious ideas.
So, again, one of a number of very special rights in our state constitution. You're going to hear some more about this important NGO, the Human Rights Network, so I won't get into the details of what they do and why they do it. I did want to bring your attention to, when you think about economic, social, and cultural rights, the ones that we tend to not pay much attention to on the international front, at least here in the United States, at the state level, most of our budget is dedicated to education, health care, and the prisons. All of those are very significant components of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, cultural, and economic rights. So we do have a place in this milieu of human rights. Now, there's way too much on this page to read to you, but I threw out the question, timely, I think, and worthy of conversation is, okay, here in Montana, since we're here, is health care a human right? Well, there's a lot of substantive language to suggest that, yes, absolutely, we have a right to affordable, effective health care. It's sort of embedded in the Universal Declaration. It's embedded in the International Covenant, to which we're not a party as yet, as a country. And there it is again in the Montana Constitution. So you can derive from these important documents at least a principled argument that, yes, it's a human right. It's not just desirable. At the same time, it's important to remember that rights like this are regarded both internationally and domestically as within this realm of progressive realization. They're not automatic. It's when your society can afford it, can get the job done, that right really kicks into gear. And this is true all over the world. That's the enduring distinction between civil and political rights and economic rights. They're there, but you have to have the means to realize them. So we're left with these enduring controversies and quandaries. There are still these persistent schisms between people who believe in natural and political rights people who favor individual and group rights. And I should mention and backtrack a little bit, both of those covenants in the International Bill of Rights, they both have identical provisions for self-determination as a human right. That's a group right, not an individual right. And that has caused of huge controversy and problems worldwide. When groups have rights that are in conflict with individual rights, we've got a lot of things to sort out. The weaponization of human rights refers to the NGOs and others, governments, who decide not to be fair-minded about the human rights situation in a given country. And the most blatant example of this is in the Israel-Palestine conflict. There are virtually no public pronouncements about human rights violations other than those committed by Israel. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it's one example where you can take a situation and not be even-minded about it, just go after one party. And the United Nations has been entertaining resolutions that the United States has always vetoed, along with Israel, when they get a chance to vote. They don't have a veto. But Israel is always spelled out as the violator of human rights. Whereas we know human rights are being violated all over the Middle East and by Hamas and other Palestinian groups as well. Universal jurisdiction is a very interesting controversy. That holds that someone guilty of a human rights crime in Chile can be brought into court in Spain. And I'm just picking those countries because those are actual cases. There's an argument in the law that if you're abusing human rights in a particularly bad way, you can be hunted down, extradited, and tried in a country completely foreign to you. The United States is not keen on this principle, but some countries are pursuing it. And again, national sovereignty, the prime organizing principle of international relations, is the main impediment to progress on human rights. Because the basic argument that people have with their government is, it's with a sovereign government, that the government is abusing their rights. There are these arguments going on in the literature. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip by that, and we can come back to it in our discussion if we choose to. So, as usual, I want to leave you with some kind of pithy quotes and a few questions for you to ponder before you come up and ponder them out loud. The first is a quote from President Jimmy Carter. Sounds good, but is it reasonable to talk about countries as having souls? The second is by an observer of the United Nations, a British fellow, and he's just reiterating, I think, what I've been suggesting, that the main struggle for human rights is between citizens and their governments. And the deck is stacked against the citizens. And this question, is it practicable to speak and act in support of human rights by referring to international law? That's a question for us in Montana. Does it actually help the cause in Montana to place our situations, our rights struggles in the context of international law or not? I'd like to say that yes, but I'm not sure that that's the right answer. And then finally, the whole notion of human rights laws is couched in the belief that if a government is going to treat its own citizens humanely and not abuse people, it's likely to not be aggressive with respect to other countries. In other words, there's a continuum. If you're not going to punish your own people, you're not going to go out and invade or abuse your neighbors. That's the theory. But it doesn't seem necessarily so that that's how it works. Human rights, which the United States is an aggressive proponent of human rights elsewhere. We sort of set the stage, we rewrite the ticket, and a lot of NGOs are based in the United States. So we're very loud and clear about what's going on in other countries. We refuse, as a country, to have those same laws and principles be brought home and made available to our own citizens. And that's the last thing I'll say is when the United States ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they used a legal technique of using declarations and reservations and understandings written out that basically make all of the rights available in the international covenants unavailable to American citizens. We cannot go to court and assert international legal rights under that covenant. The other part of that was, the reasoning was, these rights are already guaranteed. We meet the test because we have our own Constitution guaranteeing all these rights. But in just one instance, in the prison system, we have more prisoners per capita than any other country in the world. That's just one area where it might be interesting to see people incarcerated in the justice system make application to an international body for the violation of their human rights. But that's not legally permissible as we speak. So with that, I'll leave you to ponder. We'll take a short break, and we'll come back and have a larger discussion. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Welcome back. It's time for this group discussion. And I'm going to step away from this lectern and sit with you so you don't have to look up to me. Again, I'm just going to join in with you from time to time as the Spirit moves, but please self-select whomever would like to be the first person to discuss this topic of human rights, and we'll give it a go. Of course, I could assign it to somebody. Why don't we start with John?
Yeah, one of the unexpectedly wisest things I have done the last couple of years is I stopped in at Plains, Georgia, and visited the hometown of Jimmy Carter. I didn't really think too much of him as a president, even though I'm a Democrat, and I kind of picked up the mainstream trivialization of the man, which should never have happened. He was really quite remarkable. He is quite remarkable and continues to be, and his wife. And when you're there in Plains, Georgia, you begin to realize that this is a person who takes his spiritual life very seriously, has done some very courageous things, and really is quite a leader, and I think he'll come out that way in the wash. So on this phrase, human rights is the soul of our foreign policy, because human rights is the very soul of our sense of nationhood. I doubt that a speechwriter wrote that. I'm sure Jimmy Carter did. And the first part of that, I would say, human rights is the soul of Jimmy Carter's administration's foreign policy, and I'll just set that aside. But his comment that human rights is the very soul of our sense of nationhood, I would say that has some merit. And, I come from the academic or intellectual background, if there is such a thing, that don't anthropomorphize nations. That was rule number one with international relations at Columbia when I was there, School of International Affairs. However, I think his use of the word soul is more poetic. Now, I'm not saying a metaphor. I'm saying poetic in the way that poetry is Irish fire. Soul, brevity is the soul of wit. Well, he conveyed something that I think is true about our country, that we are a set of rights rather than a piece of geography. The fatherland may be the soul of another nation, or the motherland may be the soul of another nation, if you want to use a metaphor, but I think he's right in saying that rights, human rights, are the soul of America.
Well, and I was choosing to begin by focusing on this concept of the United States being the promoter of human rights, being the advocate of human rights, being the clanging cymbal, the loudest voice at times, and yet, as was pointed out, we don't like to subject ourselves to the same scrutiny that we like to subject others to. And there are a variety of legitimate reasons for that. As noted, we do have extraordinary protections written into our national documents. Our Supreme Court has, in general, over the last 50 years or so, a good record of upholding and even expanding those rights through judicial activism. Our legislatures less so an excellent record of protecting human rights, though in some states and certainly in the U.S. Congress that ebbs and flows. I think one of the things that I find most difficult to answer, though, in all of this is what is the correct role if we claim to be what we claim to be, this sort of U.S. exceptionalism, and we say we've got this correct, and our documents frame the way these other international documents are created. From where does this hesitancy to allow our own country to be subject to these larger units, from where does it come? And I think it goes back to the earlier conversations that we've had. It goes back to our notion of sovereignty. And so that's, for me, always the conflict, always, whether it's the U.S. Deep South states resisting a national push for human rights not so many years ago, or the United States as a country resisting the International Court.
I really love our founding documents. I think they're great, but they, even at that time, showed the country's sort of hypocrisy or uncomfortableness with itself. That we had that all men are created equal, and that statement wasn't even quite true. It was all white sort of landowning men. So that there was slavery at the time of this country starting. Women didn't have the right to vote. Certainly Native Americans, I don't believe, got the right to vote until like the 1940s or something. So that we've had this battle within ourselves, and so then certainly if we're not clear about it or of one mind even in the beginning, we're certainly not going to let another country tell us what to do.
Human rights was something for me personally. It was something that motivated my whole life in the sense that, first of all, the founding documents of our country are aspirational, and they give voice to things that I came as a young man to truly believe in. And I feel the same way about in 1948, 2 years after I was born, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To this day, that's a document that the world could aspire to be like. But I grew up in the tumultuous time of the 60s, and we seemed to be very inconsistent with our value of human rights. And it was actually the whole civil rights movement that brought me into the world of politics, not because I wanted to be involved in politics, but I wanted to be involved in change. And so I think about, because of my concern for human rights, worried about especially the treatment of African Americans in our country, was just a devastating experience for me. I grew up on a military base, so thanks to President Truman, I didn't actually experience segregated schools, and some of the things that we saw on TV in the early 60s were beyond my belief. Even though I had lived in the South, I just couldn't believe that this was happening in my country. The long and the short of it is that as I've now had over 40 years of experience in government and politics and progressively more responsible positions, I come back to what is maybe the core of my soul, is that human rights on our state level, we could talk about the non-discrimination ordinance process across the state the last couple of years. We could talk about the devastating situation for Native Americans in our state. When I came back from Vietnam, I became a VISTA volunteer. That's brought me here to work on healthcare access issues. So I sort of feel like healthcare could be an important human rights as well. I know it from the ground up, and I know it for 40 years. But I remember going to Busby and Ashland in 1972 and thinking, I can't believe that there's this much poverty in our country at this time in 1972. Now that I've been in Montana for almost 42 years, I can look back and say the poverty that exists today on our reservations and with our native population all across the country is devastating, even farther behind. Unemployment of 60 and 70% on the reservations. You can go to the urban African-American communities, 60, 70, 90%. We could talk about over-incarceration. We could talk about a lot of things that make me come back to what I think is, well, it may not be the soul of our foreign policy, but it's the soul of my existence, that the human rights touchstone is a good place to still strive as individual human beings, one another, to try to improve our situation using those values in our Constitution, and our state constitution, and then the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's worthy of our strivings, and I was gratified to hear Stephen say earlier tonight that the Millennium Goals, even though they seem farther away, have actually been achieved because people articulated them and then worked towards them, and that's where I choose to start our discussion tonight on human rights. Worthy things for us all to do and think about, and how to look at problems in our state and in our society.
As I was reading over the information for today, I was struck by having lived extensively and worked in places that might be considered major human rights violators. I'm always struck by the power of the individual, and that's where human rights start for me. The power of the individual in our hearts and in our minds and in our actions and what we do every day. And I have seen Israelis and Palestinians cooperate when their governments refuse to do so. That is a testament to human rights. I've seen men in Pakistan stand up for the rights of women. That is about human rights on the ground level. And I think it's a throwdown. I think it's a challenge to all of us when we despair for what's going on at the UN and we despair for what's going on in our own state. It's, do we stand up for the rights of our students who are in a group that should be protected in the state of Montana but aren't? Do we stand up for people that are oppressed? Do we stand up for people that don't have health care? I mean, that's where it starts. And we can't expect, I don't think, the UN or the state of Montana or anyone else to stand up for these rights until we are willing to put ourselves out there on the front line and do that. And so I think that's where this conversation has to start.
I've spent probably the better part of the 40 years of my career as a lawyer and as a justice involved in human rights, and I'm one of those people that does actually believe that human beings have natural human rights. I think that the Montana Constitution in Article 2 encapsulates many of those natural rights. The rights in Article 2, Section 3 to the pursuit of happiness and health and safety and to a clean and healthful environment and to own and possess property. The rights in Section 4 of the inviolable right of human dignity, the right to equal protection of the laws and freedom from discrimination, the right in Article 2, Section 10 of the right of individual privacy, and the right in Article 2, Section 11, or of 17 of the right to due process of law. These are natural rights, and I think they adhere to each of us as human beings as part of the human, sentient, self-conscious species. When I read Stephen's very thorough handout and listened to his remarks tonight, it struck me that at least in my view, there are three impediments to the realization of these natural rights and to the implementation of the understandings of the NGOs that I think have very high-minded mission statements. And I'm looking at these on a global scale, although I suppose somewhat you can reduce it down by state, county, local government, and so forth. But looking at this as a global issue, I think there are three impediments to the realization of the implementation of these natural rights and human rights. The first is nationalism. I think that's been touched on by other discussants. The belief that my sovereign goals and values and way of life should take precedence over other people's sovereign values, goals, and ways of life, and often to the exclusion of those. I think, unfortunately and sadly, the United States of America is a prime example of that. Few countries in the world are willing to make the deep sacrifices that are necessary to achieve probably the most clear and present danger on the face of the planet, and that's climate change. There's 7.3 billion people on the face of this earth, each of us facing that calamitous, potentially, situation. The second impediment that I think is out there for the globe is free market ideology. This is an economic ideology that originated prior to the 80s, but it really took off in the 1980s. It was pushed around the world with disastrous results. But it's the economic philosophy that the free market should control the way we do business. There should be no government regulation. Government should not interfere with whatever business wants to do. And that, among other disasters worldwide, has spawned the rise of multinational corporations, which have literally become, in some cases, super citizens, if not super states in their own right. Many have the assets and income that dwarf the assets and income of the host countries in which they operated. They're basically unaccountable. They can move around the world. They pretty much do what they want. And I could roll on and on about this, but people say I talk too much, so the third and final impediment to the realization of human rights, I believe, is fanatical and fundamentalist religion. And I'm sure there are people that will disagree vehemently with me on this, but I think that a great number of the world's problems right now can be traced directly and laid at the feet of radical and fundamentalist religion. There's probably more human rights against human rights violations perpetrated in the name of religion than practically any other social movement in the world. And so I think there's the big three: nationalism, free market ideology, and fanatical and fundamentalist religious doctrine.
Following Justice Nelson is not a delight, I have to say. Nothing to add. Just kidding. I spend most of my days out talking with Montanans about, if not the human rights that are outlined in the Universal Declaration and various covenants, the values that are embedded underneath those rights: dignity, respect, equality, fairness, security. And what I can say is individuals, and to get back to whether, the difference between individuals respecting human rights and really doing work for human rights, and a government respecting, protecting, and recognizing those rights and making them part of our policy, making them not just aspirational, but part of our law, part of our society. The difference there, I think, comes down to the really uncomfortable situation that we all get into, whether we're individuals or families, communities, of giving up power, right? So I'm out in a community and I'm talking about equality with people, and generally people think that's a great idea. But when you talk about equity, it means that the people that have the most need to give something up to bring people that have the least up, and that's harder. That's a harder thing to implement, and I think that one of the things that we run into, whether it's at the local level, the state level, the national level, or the international level, is that to truly implement, to recognize, respect, protect human rights, different entities, individuals, governments need to give up power. And that is a scary thing for a lot of entities. That's the challenge. When you hear Jimmy Carter say that the soul, of our country is human rights, whether it was poetic or whether he meant literally. I think it was probably poetic. I agree with John. I think what he was talking about is it's a driving force. We care about our neighbors. Do we think that our neighbors should be able to feed and clothe themselves? Should they be able to access medical care? Should they be able to work for a living that offers dignity for their family? I think that generally most people agree. But putting that into policy is an entirely different thing, and it's a real challenge because we have to give up power in order to do it.
Well, first I want to apologize. I neglected to introduce two new discussants here at the table. Kim Abbott, who just spoke, is a co-director of the Montana Human Rights Network, which is a very active non-governmental organization in our midst. So thank you for being here. And prior to her speaking, former Justice of the Supreme Court, Jim Nelson, who has been following along the course but wasn't able to attend before now, so I'm glad you're here. And thank you for all your comments. I'll just make the invitation open at any time to our audience. If they want to join in this, all they have to do is approach a microphone, and we'll notice that and swing over to them as it happens. This is such a dense cluster of things. I mean, human rights sort of speaks to everything that really matters. And one of the schisms that I didn't really elaborate on, but want to now, given the comments that we've heard, there's just a growing chorus of criticism across the world. People who are frustrated with the United States and our sort of aggressive approach to human rights internationally, but as you say, a refusal to live by the same standard because we think we've already achieved it, so nobody can tell us how to do better. Well, more and more people are pointing to alternative systems as the way forward to achieve the social and economic rights that have always been downgraded in the West and in the United States in particular. So more and more people are pointing to China as the model for progress because the Millennium Development Goals sort of prove this out, that incredible reduction of poverty has happened in China and other less developed countries. So more and more people are thinking, well, what we need first, before we worry about voting and individual rights and civil this and civil that, we need a job, we need food, we need water. And so where are the systems that are more successfully delivering these goods and services? And once we achieve those ends, then we can go forward on the civil and political track. I find this worrisome for lots of reasons, and I'm sure I'm not alone. So does anyone actually want to talk about, how we in the West, in the United States in particular, could go about putting more emphasis on that cluster of rights that we've seemed to have regarded as, well, when we'll get around to it when we have the resources. We're never going to have the resources because that means giving up power, giving up wealth so that it's spread more equitably. So it's a mouthful. I welcome any kind of response.
I'm going to just say that we've talked about the responsibility for each one of us and the success stories that you've seen of people each to their own, one at a time, speaking up, standing up, pointing out abuses. But I'll argue that governments bear the primary responsibility for protecting human rights, whether it's the human rights you talk about of economic security. I mean, I would add to Justice Nelson's list the growing divide between not just the rich and the poor, but between the super rich, the rich, and the poor. And this growing poverty is just exacerbating the problem of human rights. But I'll put the responsibility back on governments to be the protector of human rights, the fundamental human right of a person's worth as a human being, equal protection for men and women, and for economic security for every human being. So equal rights together with a respect for national self-determination. I think you can see where we talked before, where people sat on maps, whether it was after World War II, and decided where countries would be. Poland rarely got to sit at a table where it was being decided or not decided to be a country, and we still see across the world today people deciding. So I think you can let governments be involved in self-determination while still being a protector of equal rights.
Dennis, I think you're right. I think government should be the protector of human rights. But a problem that we're seeing, and I think we're seeing it in spades in the United States right now, and you mentioned the disparity in income distribution, and that's a global problem, but it's getting worse in the United States. The problem with government protecting civil rights or human rights in the United States is that government isn't calling the shots on these things anymore. It's money, it's large corporations, it's the revolving door that our Congress has between public service and private service, the amount of money that is poured into campaigns that Warren Sussman once said, he said, we're no longer a nation of character, we're a nation of personality. And that's about the way things operate now. Candidates for political office are talk to the voters like fast food and pharmaceuticals are talk to consumers. It's terrible. And I think until we can get a handle on the money in government, the money in politics, the money it takes to get elected to political office in this country, I think we're going to continue to lose the battle, and I think we're losing it now.
I would kind of extend this a little bit and very cautiously, one never wants to argue with a learned justice, but ever so slightly argue that beyond just the issues that you mentioned, government is not set up. Government, as we know government from the earliest days, was set up primarily in defense and in the defense of the small group. So we think of, whether it was the feudal lord, they cared not for protecting human rights. That was not at all what it was about. People banded together and governments were formed as defense. And so much of our understanding of the role of government, I believe, flows from this underlying philosophy that government is there to protect us, but not protect all of us, not in the same way. So if we look at the history of what governments have done and how the role of governments has evolved, slowly we're moving in a direction where governments can take on the role of protecting human rights. But I think we have a long way to go because too many of us, quite a few of us in and out of government, still think of government primarily in terms of the facilitator of economic transactions and the protector against incursion from, foreign invaders.
I wouldn't necessarily completely disagree that there's a place for government, because I think at some point government's going to have to step up to the plate. But the truth of the matter is, and I feel this very strongly, the government's not going to care until we do, until we are willing to make the hard and difficult choices of what it takes to treat our neighbors as ourselves, to care about our neighbors. And I don't just mean my neighbor next door. I mean my neighbor across the ocean or across the desert or wherever they happen to be. And our governments aren't going to care until we make them care, until we hold them accountable for caring about some of these issues. And obviously I feel very passionately about this. And so what I think that the challenge, I think that the throwdown to our governments is, this matters to us. Now, what are you going to do about it? And if what we have is the power of the ballot box, when you don't do it, we'll try to find somebody else that will. And that, and I think to a certain extent, we all get caught up in our lives, and I think people can be sadly selfish, myself included, certainly. But when are we willing to say, we're going to take this to the vote, and we're going to, act on these things? And the other, and before I yield my time, I want to just make what I think is an important distinction. It's an important distinction for me as to the question of radical religion. I would argue that the groups that use religion to commit atrocities in the name of God or, in in the name of God, it's not about religion at all. It's about power. It's about history. It's about disenfranchisement. It's about a history far too complex to unpack in the next few minutes that we have and still get to the quiz. But that's a really important issue for me, and it's a really important issue for me in my classes, that it's not about religion. It's about a host of other things, but religion packs that really hard emotional punch.
Well, I'm interceding not to fast forward to the quiz. We'll get there in due course, but we do have a member of the audience who's indicated an interest in making comments. So to make good on a promise, we're going to hear from one of our attendees.
So this is going to wind up being a question before I'm done, and it starts with Steve. The first night you mentioned the trajectory of human rights, and my question is going to be essentially: is this cultural evolution that we're living in, and we're talking about the good that we bring, not all the stuff that we aren't getting done yet. As cultural evolution goes on, is that a trajectory that is innate, or is that the courtesy of the luxury of our times, such that the Leviathan has put down the strong man, which has been what sovereignty is most of the history of mankind, is the strong man's power over a given chunk of ground. So the good old US of A has put down the Leviathan at my door. I don't have to worry about getting pillaged or plundered very much. Is that a luxury of our times, or is that a human trajectory?
I think we forget Plato's philosopher king at our peril. You know, the philosopher king, one of the key requirements was memory. And, of course, in this country, in a democracy, we all are supposedly the philosopher kings. But I recently learned lesson. I think of China and the troubles they're having in Hong Kong with the people that don't want to have the party decide who the candidates are going to be on the ballot so they can vote for some real candidates. And here in Montana, in the political party that has the longest string of human rights that it aspires to, the Democratic Party, it endorsed its major political candidates before the filing deadline was over with, just like Tammany Hall used to 100 years ago before the People's Power League gave us the direct primary. So the answer to your question, in my experience, Bill, is that we can go backwards because we just did it in Montana.
Well, I was thinking the same thing, that we may take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or maybe now we're taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Did I just say the same thing over again? I don't know. In any event, I'm going to say that there is a part of me, there's political polyhena, that I really do believe our nation should have a soul, and that the government represents the soul of the nation. And that, I agree with what's been said thus far, that, Justice Nelson and others have said we've gotten away from the government promoting the common good to the government should have the least, not be able to regulate anything, not really be able to do anything, that our government is pretty hamstrung. And that I agree with you as well, that it starts at the individual, but really you need a community. You need a group of people working for the common good. That I think we have this sort of sense of rugged individualism, but we're really at our best when we work as a group of people working towards a common good that benefits everyone. And right now, with just the political ideology in the country, the focus on the free market, a lot of that is breaking down. And I don't know what the future holds for this country, or how we're going to kind of pick that back up again.
Yeah, I think, I definitely agree that we're at a moment in sort of representative democracy. Our government is us. It's meant to be. And I think that it is the structure, the best structure and the intended structure to protect rights. Whether it started that way, it's ended up that way. And we are at a moment where corporations and money in politics is a real challenge, I think. And there's a cynicism among everyday people about how much their voice matters in a representative democracy. And, you know, when you see a stalemate at every level of government, which I think we have for the last several cycles, it can be really hard to engage people unless you have a clear solution. And I think that there are solutions to bring a democracy back, a representative democracy back to meaningfulness for the people that are engaged in it, and it needs to be. You know, our government really is us. When we pass a budget in the state of Montana, that's what we value on a piece of paper to be implemented by our government. And, you know, we have real challenges to engage more people in that process, and we need to. And if we're going to respect and protect human rights, whether it's here in Montana at the national level or internationally, we do need people involved, making sacrifices and making commitments. And I think we do need to really face the money in politics in order to do that.
I agree that human rights has to be something that each of us believes in and supports, and it ultimately should be a grassroots sort of thing, that it should rise from the bottom. The problem is, and I sometimes think that Americans don't appreciate how far down the rabbit hole we have gone with this money situation. Despite whatever grassroots campaigns you want to believe that we can put forth in our country right now, government really doesn't care. Our political leaders really don't care. And the reason they don't care, for example, 1% of the American public is financing 80% of the campaigns for public office in this country. 80%. 30,000 people out of a population of over 300 million people are financing, putting the money in to elect people to Congress, to elect people to the Senate and the House of Representatives, and in many cases to our state legislators. So our legislators, our congresspeople, what they care about is getting reelected. And it takes a lot of money to get reelected, and the way you get a lot of money is to listen to the people who are paying it. And the people who are paying it are not the Joe Sixpack, the ordinary person that writes a letter to the editor or gives $50 to the Republicans or the Democrats. They don't really count. And our voices, our votes, because that's our voice as citizens, is our vote. Our votes don't matter all that much either. I can go vote for my favorite candidate, but if the XYZ PAC sponsors a $2 million slick negative attack ad campaign, they vote with their dollars. The Citizens United, the Supreme Court said that speech is money. Money is speech. They're the same thing. So the more money you have, the more speech you have, the more speech you can buy. And when these PACs and these corporations vote with their dollars, it drowns out my vote as an ordinary citizen. It drowns out my individual voice. And I think that's the problem that we've got to overcome before we can get this grassroots movement started and accomplish anything with it.
But Justice Nelson, I mean, I think we're never going to have the amount of money that they have.
That's right.
So in some ways, we have to change the political ideology. We have to have the Supreme Court, overturn Citizens United, or whatever the thing would, whatever it would have to be.
And good point. Citizens United needs to be overturned, but the Supreme Court is not going to overturn
I mean, whatever
it. That isn't going to happen for generations until all that majority dies off up there. There are several movements, legitimate movements in this country right now to adopt a 28th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which would effectively overturn Citizens United. Some other language that's proposed would give back to people their constitutional rights. Here's one other thing. Corporations have all these rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of free from unreasonable search and seizure, all these constitutional rights. Not one single solitary right protects any non-human entity in the federal Constitution. The word corporation is not even mentioned in the Constitution. Every one of the constitutional rights that corporations and non-human entities enjoy right now were created from whole cloth by the ultimate activist court in the country, the Supreme Court of the United States. Every one of them. That kind of nonsense has got to change. It simply does.
I hate to intercede at this point. We're going to forego the quiz. I mean, it's not a global civics gathering without a quiz, but we're not going to do it. We have 3 minutes remaining. Kim, I know you're poised to make maybe a final comment, because we do have to conclude our discussion on the spot at 8:30. Before you do get the last word, Kim, I will take an instant stab at Bill's question. And I do believe we are on a cultural evolutionary path toward the realization of human rights, but we have to cling to these ideals that are enshrined in these documents. We have to struggle to make sure they don't go down. I think in the near term, as we've been discussing, things are going to get worse, a lot worse before they get better. But they will get better because we're committed to achieving that end. Kim, please.
Oh, the final word's so much pressure. But, I do think that when Justice Nelson, mentions that we can change the United States Constitution, I do actually think we have to. And there are ways that we can do that, and it will take a grassroots movement, because Terry's right, we'll never have the money. And a lot of these efforts have failed in the past. But I do think we can do it, and I think we can do it out of a necessity, because corporate personhood, Citizens United, all of this can be corrected by serious engagement from people in the United States to change it. I think that will fix a lot. It will establish our voice as voters as equitable again, which is what needs to happen to have a responsive government and a functioning government. So I'm excited for Justice Nelson to lead that campaign from here in Helena, Montana. That's my final word.
Thank you all so much for your rigorous attention to this issue. It's interesting that, we go from a discussion about global human rights right down here to home ground, our constitutional rights in Montana. It's a nice way to end the evening. I look forward to our last session next week. But thanks once again, and we hope people watch Global Civics on television.